This is a Python version of Kubernetes. This is a Python version that doesn't use Flask. This is the source code it got translated from. Rather, a copy of it. This is the actual source code it was copied from, or rather translated from. And this is where I asked it to basically give me the Flask equivalent without doing a whole lot of monkeying around with the overall runtime. Now, what it would have done is I actually described all of the overall URL and URI calls that it would have made towards the back end. Kubernetes does use the local host address. And so as an artifact of how it runs, it has to use the local host address by naming convention, not by the IP address, even though the IP address is what it is also given. The problem is a person can use the same URL name in an Etsy resolve file or an Etsy host file and have two IPs for the same URL. And the routing server doesn't necessarily know which one to put where, because all it sees is a name and maps it to an external IP. With this solution, you could actually have two or more and confuse the server. In fact, you could have the server talk to itself without knowing it's talking to itself on two or more IP addresses. You could have it connect to itself as its own client. And that's if you're trying hard enough. If you try even harder, as you've seen, you get it to actually do the thing of translating golang its source code into Python. It tries to do that fairly well, even though it should be completely incompatible by execution model. It has syntactically found a few ways to creatively poop out something that looks functional enough that can be tested and probably is fairly functional. Now, the reason that this is barely functional is you have to fill in the blanks and do manual error checking and report the errors back to it. And then get creative about how you report the errors. The reason to actually have it built for Python is if it's built in Python and only Python, and Python runs anywhere on any device, any code that can use the least amount of code, like this model has represented, you could actually structure it to run on any cell phone, anywhere. The same is true of Docker. The same is true of Docker because it's close enough to C on its overall underlying runtime. It's just Golang attempting to imitate the overall CH root environment with a few things that are scraped out of its functional base that have been replaced by something that's supposed to be a little more secure. My point is that you could have it all run in Python. Golang and Docker containerized setups. You could have these setups including the daemon, running entirely in Python on any device. And in fact, every device. You could even have this run in separate browser tabs. And you can even have process isolation on. The nice part about having it on is that process isolation would allow for next to zero exchange of information about JavaScript loaded in other tabs, unless it's a service worker or a WebSocket-based service worker, or just a WebSocket that's running outside of a separate web worker. Excuse me. I meant to say WebSocket attached to web worker. The overall goal that they would be achieving is communication between processes of existing users on the same site. And in this case, when it comes to Kubernetes, you don't need to do that or worry about that. The point is to have those functionalities asynchronous. The point is to have it mostly asynchronous and continuously running, without the end user having to account for it being asynchronous when it runs. You also shouldn't have to worry about garbage collection, cleaning up memory, or anything else. That should all be done automatically. Once again, why are we compiling anything that can literally be translated into a language that doesn't need to be compiled any more than it already is?